to market things in a positive and profitable way. When you aren't able to do this, you aren't able to get the kind of needs that the government wants, right? So with the government promoting for the purpose of tourism, these are the narratives of what will come into effect. 5 reasons indigenous people don't get effective change. Firstly, people don't even realize anything is actually wrong because they're being advertised as happy and living well because they're not allowed to go on the television and say that's not going to be very great for your marketing. And again, it's with the purpose of tourism. Also, even if they do get visited, tourists, typically white people are the ones visiting a lot of these marginalized communities. They are adverse to hearing about the fact that they're staying in this hotel isn't actually very helpful to the indigenous cultures. Secondly, the government feels that they are benefiting the community by advertising for them. What we see is that, wow, we made them look good. We raised their cultural profile, which means they are unlikely to get any kind of meaningful kind of impacts and actually raise political capital for effective change because they feel like we've done enough. They don't need any further rights apart from this. Thirdly, now, marketing indigenous people forces them to remain frozen and complacent. So, for example, Maori might decide to close their doors to the public and Marae. The public gets mad and twists them into the narrative of how dare you guys not be grateful for all this kind of money that we're bringing you in and all this kind of tourism. When they decide to do something that culturally they feel better to them, for example, closing Marae, they're painted as these kind of people they're just perpetuating the same kind of stereotypes we don't want to have in our world. There's also possibly less cultural development as they're forced to stick with the narrative that's been proposed in the advertising. Fourthly, tourism doesn't primarily profit indigenous. It's unlikely someone will visit rural Hawaii and instead will go to the cushy hotel and buy a tidy shirt and wear a coconut bra, which, by the way, is a sacred form of culture that's been profited from, which happens very often. And even if indigenous people see some of the profits of tourism, maybe because even though they're probably not the ones building the hotels, say they see some of those profits somehow, it's not going to be raising the standard of living. Extreme land and environment destruction. Hotels and commercial beaches destroy local habitat. Communities rely on surviving off this land for their own well-being and their standard of living. The land is also culturally significant. There is ancestral connection. There's a place of community here which you are disrupting. They are also typically forced to be displaced by the influx of tourism. You don't see them being able to live in these same places anymore where they've always been. There's also increased pollution damaging the air quality, and said land that they need facilities to cater for tourists are just going to destroy the land completely. No one hears about the fact that on many beaches, commercial beaches, they have to, especially for example in India, they have to sweep all the garbage and dump it off into a place that the tourists can't see. These are the kind of things that are actually damaging indigenous people. It's these kind of things we cannot stand from this debate. And the outcome of this, we see no real change because people don't realize they need help. They're painted as ungrateful to white people, and indigenous cultures are most affected by negative statistics like homelessness, like incarceration, like unemployment, like mental health. And by painting indigenous people as happy and complacent, not only is fundamentally problematic, but also does not help them with their standard of living and only damages the sacredness of their culture, which is likely to be capitalized on, like with that example of the coconut bra now being worn really happily. I'll now take a POI.
How does your side change the displacements and stuff from tourism if you're still having people trying to market this where companies can possibly come and exploit them?
Can you say that again? I'm a little bit confused by what you meant.
If you don't have the government, do you think that companies will be likely to come and exploit them instead?
Okay, so saying that, it's fine that if the government aren't exploiting them, someone else will, and we're happy for that to happen in this debate. No, we'd rather see giving indigenous people rights and we'd rather have them not painted with these stereotypes of living happily and complacently. We'd rather not have those kind of damages. We'd rather stand for them actually having more likelihood of having their standard of living, because when you destroy land and the environment with these kind of things, it's fundamentally awful. And we also think it's most likely for governments to exploit exploit this on a larger level than other bigger companies, because governments, they can simply put in place that, oh, we don't want internationals to be investing here, we're going to invest here. We think that is fundamentally wrong in this debate. Thirdly, now on to how we still get affected tourism. Even though we've already proven to you why it's really damaging for indigenous cultures, let's look at it from maybe how it affects an entire nation of people. So an example of where governments can promote tourism healthfully and get those kind of benefits is many Central Europe countries don't actually have indigenous cultures typically, and are able to promote tourism in a way that's not exploitative. For example, Sweden, you might have snowboarding, those kind of things. Like you can still promote tourism really healthfully. So judge, even if you value tourism and its impact on a nation, it's so easy and less harmful for governments to promote non-tokenistic tourism like Bondi Beach or the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Maybe not Veggie Night Australia, but they can still promote tourism healthfully. That's what we stand for in this debate. We stand not for exploiting people, we stand not for exploiting people, proud to affirm.
Affirming try to characterize government promotions of indigenous cultures as the big bad wolf trying to tokenize these cultures, but we rather think that government promotions are the knight in shining armor, allowing exposure of these cultures to a variety of people. What is our path to victory in today's debate? We need to prove that we benefit indigenous people, indigenous cultures and people when this type of promotion from the government takes place. How are we going to do this? Through 3 points. Firstly, we'll talk about how we benefit local indigenous communities. Secondly, why it benefits indigenous global communities as part of on a global scale. And then Levi will split and tell you about the economic benefits. And before that, some characterization. So what does this promotion look like? It looks like promoting huggers at rugby. It looks like having Māori carvings through boat, boat tours. It looks like promoting throat singing practices, which is a Native American practice. It looks like having Aboriginals in Australia giving didgeridoo concerts. All of those type of things is what we support. What is the alternative when this promotion is not taking place? It looks like tourism companies promoting and selling the culture, because if the government doesn't, it is likely that they will. This is really bad because the company is much more likely to engage with sensationalization of the product. They begin to sell the product, not the culture, which is what the government will do, because we'll explain that later. But the alternative is the government is operating outside of profit incentives, because government manages society, whereas a company manages a profit, right? This means the government is a lot more subjective to public scrutiny, which manifests in voter responses, which is influenced by people's sense of justice, especially in situations such as post-colonial reparations, which we'll expand on in our second point. Before that, some rebuttal. So like a quick clarification, which I think is really important as well, it would be nice to have Indigenous owned businesses promoting their culture. AF doesn't tell us why this is likely to happen. And if those structural reasons are so bad, then they probably, then this type of business probably doesn't exist. And if they do, it's a very small platform that does not enable them as a government-based platform could, right? Because when you hear from a government that we like this culture and we endorse this culture, you're more likely to want to engage in it because of the influence politicians have over you, which is what they characterize already. Moving on to our first point, which is how we benefit local Indigenous communities. There are two parts to this point. Firstly, why this leads to historical injustices being corrected. We need to prove that this leads to more positive policies and societal attitude changes for Indigenous people within society. So how do we prove this? Firstly, we make Indigenous culture more entwined with the country's national identity. There are a couple of parts to this point. Firstly, if a citizen in a nation, is in a nation, for example, like in New Zealand, they've got an inclination of what their national identity looks like. It comes from being taught in schools. It comes from what their national sports team perpetuates. So what this means is it starts to ingrain cultural practices within society. So regardless of the intent, when you promote Indigenous cultures, it means that you've got to have some type of those Indigenous cultures within your society. This looks like when you're trying to prove that Māori culture is integral to New Zealand, and that's why it's so important to.
On that point,
have tourism, it means that you've got te reo in schools. It means learning about colonization, for example, the Treaty of Waitangi, so therefore their voices are heard, negating a huge part of what affirming try to tell us already. But thirdly, this creates attachment of wider society to the culture because of the sentiment that the country you live in becomes the country you adopt into your identity, right? It's like everyone saying, everyone like engaging in the haka when the All Blacks doing it and feeling that sense of pride. But we also fourthly tell you that unemployment, which is what they said really plagued these Indigenous communities, is improved because the Indigenous people will be hired in the tourism businesses for this authenticity. They don't want to whitewash it because we're going to get into that actually. So why is this important? It means that mainstream people have a greater appreciation of the Indigenous culture because they've been exposed to it, because it hasn't just been gatekept to the Indigenous community who are likely to engage with those businesses because they live in like similar areas and that's like what they know about. But we tell you that it's really important to note that these Indigenous cultures have most likely faced colonial oppression, which means that you increase sympathy and appreciation, which creates political capital for these Indigenous groups, which can lead to pressure in the government to implement policies that are going to support these Indigenous cultures because it's been whitewashed because it's done by a government. But we tell you that promotion leads to acceptance because it is being promoted by a government, right? Governments influence people's beliefs and like their belief is endorsing this Indigenous culture. Rather than oppressing Māori, which we've seen like historically and not allowing them to speak their own language, we are now encouraging it and enforcing others to do the same. It looks like learning te reo Māori in school. But like secondly, the second part of this point is we tell you that we connect disconnected Indigenous people. Why are Indigenous people disconnected? Colonialism had practices which separated Indigenous systems from the culture and forced assimilation through urbanization. This looked like civilizing Indigenous children and putting them in colonial schools to educate them for the European way of losing. It looks like pushing Indigenous people into urban areas which have a white majority due to the concentration of resources and biased distribution of these resources.
On that point.
But rather, we tell you that you lose out on culture on that side because an Indigenous person isn't exposed to their culture because it's not in the mainstream. And even if it is, it's probably whitewashed because it's done by a company who's just trying to make profit. And so how we change this is we're making the culture more accessible and representative. And we tell you that even if it's like not a traditionally cultural areas, they're going to adopt some type of Indigenous cultures for tourism, especially due to the mass promotion because they know it's going to be good for their economy. But secondly, we tell you that this is exclusive to government promotion because the government has more power by connections in social fields to get accurate information. It looks like iwi being more willing to work with a Māori representative from the government who they relate to rather than some salesperson who doesn't actually value your culture, they just value the profit. But lastly, we tell you that the government has an incentive not to whitewash because it feeds into the colonial mentality, which in society where these promotions takes place, they've got to appeal to the voter population. And if the government is willing to do the promotion, it's probably because they're going to get buy-in from voters. Yes, I'll take a point.
How will you protect sacred aspects of culture that are closed practices being used and appropriated by people outside of that culture?
We tell you that just because you are promoting culture doesn't mean that those sacred practices have to be exploited. We gave you the examples of going and seeing a Māori carving. Like you don't actually have to go into the marae and like take away from their personal safe space to be able to do that. Moving on to our second point, which is why we benefit the Indigenous community as part of a global community. We need to prove that Indigenous people get more recognition, sympathy, and a voice on an international scale. How do we do this? When you go to a country, the Indigenous culture is obviously more abundant and obvious because of all of the promotion and the fact that it is profitable. So what this means is there's more acceptance of cultures internationally, but it also leads to more international buy-in, right? Because people from an international stage who have come to your country know about the culture. This leads tourists having an authentic experience of the Indigenous community. But secondly, they view the Indigenous community in a positive light because they've also like formed that meaningful connection with them, right? It means they're more likely to care about the state's treatment of the Indigenous community because they've had that personal interaction and experience with them. But secondly, we tell you that the tourists, because they're like going to another country, it's most likely that they do have some money and they're likely to spend that money on Indigenous cultural businesses, which they have gone to because of the tourism, because of that widespread promotion, because they knew about that, which AF doesn't get. But like they're going to probably buy things from them to have tokens to take home, to show their family, to share. Whereas the government is likely to have a more distributed and fair allocations of the funds and are likely to funnel the profits into the iwi or into Indigenous cultures, firstly because it means that they can improve the like Indigenous sites that people are going to, but secondly because of colonial reparations by a voter incentive and principal obligation, right? They feel a need to look at people. But why this is important, we tell you that international pressure allows for more checks and balances when you're thrusting Indigenous culture into the spotlight.
Imagine you are a cultural minority. You're an ethnic individual living in a country. Say, for example, you're a native Hawaiian living in Hawaii. Your government has decided that you are now the cultural attraction. People are coming to visit your culture, and so you need to perform for them. This puts you in this box. It limits your cultural growth and forces you to stay that way for the rest of time in order to remain attractive as a tourist attraction. We gave you plenty of examples of how this works at first through Arcadia's substantive points, and we didn't hear much response from that from the NEG team. Today, I'll be doing three things for you. I've got 2 points of clash. Firstly, on who benefits Indigenous peoples the most, and secondly, on who gets better close cultural inclusivity. And finally, I'll deliver you my split point today on how we effectively raise cultural profile of Indigenous people without this need for this mass tourism stuff. So the first point of clash, well, the main thrust that we've heard from the NEG team today is that if the government doesn't do this tourism stuff, companies will. Now, this is not true for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's not slave labor. The Indigenous people aren't forced into doing this. We tell you that governments have a unique position over these Indigenous peoples and that they are the guardians of their rights. The governments have a unique vantage point with which to control these people and force them into certain things because these people are relying on these governments to protect their rights and their land and continue to give them these places to live. This is simply not the same on our side of the house with these companies. Companies simply do not have the same power over these Indigenous people. We simply do not see these companies being able to violate these people's rights or pass laws in their favor in order to force these things in. So what we tell you then secondly is that these people are able to not consent to it. They are able to tell these companies, actually, this is our private property. We're not letting you in on our maraes in New Zealand, or we're not letting you into the Navajo Nation in America, or we're not letting you come into our cultural reserves in Hawaii. And this is something that so what we tell you is that this is a unique harm to the NEG's case today, and that it is not mutually harmful on both sides like they would have you believe. Thirdly, we tell you that the government, when they are deciding not to do this mass tourist marketing, they are able to refocus their efforts, as I'll expand later on my split point, on effectively raising the cultural profile of these people within their nations. This means that they are able to uniquely protect those rights rather than allowing them to be violated by companies. Their second thrust was about how it would entwine our culture with their culture, with our national identity. This is not true for, we have several examples of how this doesn't happen. They focus exclusively today on New Zealand and the Māori people and about how we may have been seeing this happen. And while that may be true in New Zealand, we tell you that it's simply not always the case. We tell you firstly that in Hawaii, this has not happened at all. The government has been promoting Hawaii as a place to go see the Hawaiian people. And as our first speaker has told you about seeing them put on the hula skirts and do a cool little dance and crack open a coconut and drink some coconut milk. And this does not come anywhere near giving this cultural identity entwining with national identity that the NEG team would have you believe. They didn't respond to any of this material that Arcadia gave to you. Secondly, we tell you that this doesn't happen in other parts of America with the Navajo Nation. We see the similar things happening where the government refuses to connect them up properly with water systems and power systems and refuse to give them the infrastructure that is necessary in their cultural reservations. We see similar things happening around the world in these different Indigenous things. And we would tell you that New Zealand is in the minority in how inclusive we are with our culture. And we simply cannot stand for a case that only works just in specifically New Zealand. What do we tell you today on this point? We've told you a lot of material about how we can raise, how we do not turn these Indigenous peoples into a commodity. We are not engaging in this tokenistic material actions which simply degrade them and force them into a box. We do not freeze them as time, as our first speaker has told you, by forcing them to remain as they are, because the moment they start developing their culture or moving in a different direction, they become unmarketable as a tourist attraction and so face significant backlash. So why is this so important? Well, today we believe the most important people in this debate are the Indigenous peoples of the world. We believe that fundamentally their rights are what we need to be fighting for in this debate. And so any slight to those rights, like they are giving you on the next side of the house, simply cannot be tolerated. We need to be campaigning for these cultures to be able to be given the rights that they deserve as the Indigenous peoples of these lands. I'll now accept that point of information.
You say that you want to campaign for the rights of these Indigenous people, But when you're giving them no job opportunities, so taking away the promotion of their cultures, how are you allowing them to get
We tell you that these people do not need jobs promoting their cultures. We tell you that these people are perfectly capable of finding jobs in other industries. There's nothing stopping a Māori person from having a job in any industry in New Zealand, except for maybe some systemic issues, which are unfortunate and we would like to change in New Zealand. We tell you that there is nothing stopping a Native Hawaiian person taking any job in Hawaii, and they do not need to be forced into a job where they promote their culture. We tell you this is reinforcing the systemic injustice that we are trying to stop. And the second clash today has been about who gets better cultural inclusivity. Their main thrust today has been about how it would, how the tourism promotes the culture domestically and how that will allow us to learn better in school. We tell you that this is not true for a couple of reasons. First, this is a white savior complex where it is white governments campaigning to white tourists about how they should come and view these cultures and see and pity these people for how terrible their lives may be, and see these people in the Navajo Nation and see how sad it is that they have been not been given to the infrastructure they need. What have we told you on this point? We have told you about how we would rather campaign for cultural rights on this. We would rather allow these cultures to develop in their own unique ways and not force them into campaigning for their own cultural tourism. So that takes me nicely into my split point about how we effectively raise cultural profiles of Indigenous people. Ned would have you believe that the only way to raise these people's cultural profile and to give them this give these benefits is to promote these peoples on a global scale. Because of many of but we tell you that due to many of the mechanisms that Arcadia has given you today, we tell you that this is simply not the case. These people are frozen in time. They are forced not to develop their cultures. They face inabilities to rise above past these issues because these issues are then hidden by the very nature of this marketing. And so at the end of the day, we do not get this raising of the cultural of their cultural identity. So how do we better raise their cultural profile on our side of the house? Firstly, we tell you that by giving these Indigenous peoples, we do this by giving these Indigenous peoples their own rights to pursue their own goals. We tell you that we do not need to force them to pursue tourism because that's what we think is best for them. Instead, we're able to give them their own ability to choose what their own way is. Maybe they do not want to run a tourist hotspot on showing off their cultural identity and turning it into this commodity that is brought and sold. Secondly, we tell you that by using this money that we've been using for this cultural promotion, we can raise the start trying to tackle some of these issues that they may be facing. We can be trying to raise standards of living or invest in cultural initiatives that they may be starting, or try and start to tackle some of the systemic injustice that we may be facing. Finally, we tell you that we can pursue government's systems of co-governance or self-governance, like in the Navajo Nation, but without the forcing these people to go without things that we have stolen from them, like this infrastructure. And so at the end of the day, we give these people the opportunity to choose for themselves what is best for themselves. And so at the end of the day, the moot must stand for the Indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you.
Am I audible? Whilst it would be nice to have indigenously owned businesses promoting their own culture and having their own autonomy, both economically and culturally, that is not the reality that side affirming gets. Because when their entire push is about why colonization is bad and that we are perpetuating the harms of colonization, they then cannot stand on the ideal world where suddenly these harms don't exist, that these businesses are able to thrive, and that the Māori person can get a job by just simply walking into any given business, because these structural issues do exist. We're the only side that addresses that in any capacity. That is why they lose. We also tell you on this clarification and characterization, as Jess has already told you at first, that this is generally, this type of policy is generally likely to take place in a more living in to do that. There obviously needs to be a voter incentive. There obviously needs to be a wider push for that policy. That means that people aren't actively against indigenous communities. That means that the government is promoting something that people will vote for. And that means that these colonization issues aren't that bad as they portray. And if they are, they still lose on this point for the reason we'll give. 3 things I'll be doing in my speech then. Firstly, on decolonization and aiding its efforts. Secondly, on cultural representation and its accuracy. And thirdly, I'll be splitting on economic benefits. Firstly, then on decolonization and its efforts. What we've heard is from side affirming is a extensive case on how this is like masking these colonial issues, those historical harms through some kind of phony reparations. We firstly resent this because we think it pushes indigenous culture into the mainstream regardless of intent, right? As Jess has already explained to you at first, the fact that people are trying to make it, the fact that people are trying to foster a environment where tourists come and feel that indigenous culture that is sold to them means that people are learning things like te reo phrases in schools. It means that there's that push to try and overcome those structural barriers that exist on either side. No engagement with this material here. Secondly, we say that it makes more people more likely to push for change for a culture because they have an affinity with that culture, right? When you get things like the haka on a massive display for the quintessential New Zealand male who loves himself a good rugby match, that obviously makes him care more about Māori culture, that obviously makes him identify that with his New Zealand culture, because that is what his national sports team represents. When those two things align more with each other, what we get is a more sympathetic nation. What we get is people compelled to learn and care more about those issues, and that is exclusive to our side because their alternative is isolationism in the name of sacred culture that ultimately dies out in the process, as I'll get to later. Thirdly, even if you don't believe that, we think that the harm there is greatly mitigated by the fact that these structures aren't going to be that terrible and dismal if people and therefore the government endorse this type of promotion.
On that point.
Sure.
So what about the cultures that don't want to be promoted for tourism, like many pagan African nations who prefer to live and thrive outside Western intervention? How are you helping them?
Please tell me an instance where a pagan African nation has been promoted for tourism. That's not actually a relevant context anyway. And even if it was, we tell you that it's much more important that those pagan African nations are dying out and struggling to survive, as opposed to maybe having some slightly questionable use of coconut bikinis. To expand on that then, the second push here is that we get that consent is lacking. We think that is much more problematic on side affirming side when you get international independent tourist firms doing it. Why? Because a traveling salesman isn't a public figure subject to public judgments and checks and balances. If he is rejected by a marae, as they say, then the cultural selling, like the selling of that culture becomes much more racist. It becomes much more less accurate on their side of the house. The reason this is still likely to take place is for side affirming to have any harms. We need to assert that the main reason a government would do this is for profit. If there's a profit incentive to promote exotic culture, then businesses will jump on that in a heartbeat, because that is what they are standing for on their side of the house. We also tell you, secondly here, on another key push, was on tokenizations. Look, government have incentive to be accurate in every representation because they're likely to get called out for it in these more liberal societies I've already characterized. Because it's unlikely a really racist society is going to endorse a government doing this, as voter and taxpayer pressure is probably going to dissuade them from engaging with Indigenous communities anyway. Therefore, we are probably already dealing with a society relatively sympathetic to Indigenous communities. Is the reason, say, New Zealand has this type of promotion as opposed to Australia, which actually shafts Aboriginal communities very, very actively. And therefore, we think it's much more a reflection of that society rather than masking any great harm. We also think, lastly, that that society, as an extension of that government, is probably going to want to therefore promote an accurate representation, because that society and its journalists will probably call them racist. That's probably not very good for that public image. Lastly, then, on muddying like the Indigenous voice with superficial things. Look, we think that what's important here is that we get more of an Indigenous voice on any sort of political issues on our side of the house. The government is trying to promote a culture. They need to engage with that culture as a baseline. Therefore, they need to communicate with these Indigenous communities to an extent. No, thank you. This gives those leaders of those cultures a voice in political matters regarding their culture as an extension wider issues. It is some progress towards decolonization that we get exclusively on our side of the house on the track that I've already given you on the fact that these nations are already on that pathway. Lastly, then, where F fails to engage with us is the fact that we reconnect those people who've suffered from forced assimilation. And if colonization is as great and as terrible as it says, that group is most Indigenous people. That is people who have been grown up in these urban societies because they go there because they need to get a job elsewhere, as side affirming tries to tell us they can do it second. And it leads to them becoming relatively more disconnected from that culture. When we make it more mainstream, we facilitate this type of change, we allow those people to reconnect. Therefore, we get that type of change and start to decolonization. F shows their ignorance when they lastly go and tell an Indigenous person can just go in and get a job, because no, if colonization is as bad as you say, and that's something that you want to solve, then you cannot ignore this issue in its entirety with this type of barbaric statement. Secondly, then, on cultural representation and its accuracy. What we've heard from side affirming is that these people are painted as as happy and complacent. Look, I've already responded to why the logic of this point doesn't really work, because one, you're still getting businesses doing that, and secondly, a government is probably trying to make people not do that if it's willing to do this type of policy. But also, if that's not accurate on that point, there will probably be a pushback, right? If Indigenous communities are suddenly portrayed as these happy people and they are extremely upset, there is that type of uprising, there is that type of reason to do it, because if those issues are so important and they're being masked, then there's probably a problem. Secondly, on damaging the sacredness of culture, look, if both sides have fear to do this type of thing, if side affirming wants the reality they tell us at the start, we don't endorse this. But we say that this is the type of attitude that leads to these cultures becoming isolationist, being shut off from them. They don't care. People leave that community because they don't get to engage with things like mainstream opportunities. And this kills the culture. It allows a government to get away with not caring themselves. It is ultimately leading to more harmful outcomes for that community. Lastly, then, to split on economic benefits. Look, even if you don't believe that we can do all these things we say about culture, we still think we benefit these communities economically. Why? Firstly, because we get the economic benefits, because as I've already characterized, exotic stuff sells. It's the reason that companies and governments both do this to some capacity. Secondly, that economic growth benefits the Indigenous communities more than tourist attractions would. For instance, tourists spending money at a marae on carvings is better than them building a dope theme park on Indigenous land. That's probably a harmful thing, because tourism is still happening on either side of the house. This is probably a far better way for it to take place. Lastly, tourist firms tend to be multinational corporations. That money is therefore going out overseas as opposed to into a nation, into a marae, into a cultural environment. So proud to oppose.
Just checking that I'm audible. The point at which side negating lost the debate today is the point at which they chose to focus their entire case on the notion that if minority indigenous communities don't want to participate in tourism, it's fine to just let them die out. We think that is a fundamentally enormous harm that they brought to you today and seem to show no remorse for, particularly at second. I'm going to do two things for you in this debate today. Firstly, clarify for you what we had to do to win. And secondly, I'm going to bring you 3 points of clash, one on who gets better outcomes for Indigenous people and communities, one on who gets better cultural inclusivity, and thirdly, I'm going to bring you a minor point about who gets better tourism outcomes. Firstly, though, let's think about what we had to do to win. Under our side, we had to prove to you why we get better outcomes and protection for Indigenous people and cultures when we don't allow the government to advertise and promote them as a way of tourism. In order for them to win, they had to prove to us that actually it's not a harm for the government to do this. They had to prove to us that Indigenous communities are actually better off when the government does do this. They've ultimately failed. I'm going to tell you why. Firstly, about who gets better outcomes for Indigenous people and communities. At first, we heard that the government will send representatives to engage with iwi, that Indigenous people will be employed in tourism businesses if they engage in tourism, and that acceptance will be promoted by the government. And then at second, we heard that the structures that these people fall victim to because of colonization just actually aren't that bad. They kind of seem to be their tire push there. That's a bit iffy. Let's talk about why. Firstly, let's talk about the goal of minority communities, right? They've tried to tell you that the goal of minority communities is to be a marketable thing. We tell you this isn't the goal of minority communities. The goal of minority communities is literally to preserve the culture that colonizers have tried to destroy. Even if some communities have a goal to make money off their culture, that's a choice we think they should be able to make for themselves. They should be able to run as an independent business, not influenced by the government. We think that's really, really crucial, right? We think the government, who Katie told you at first, has a lot of power and a lot of influence because they literally control whether these people get rights under the status quo. We think it's really coercive to assume that the government is a good actor to be taking over these minority communities. They tried to push you then that if the government didn't do it, it'd be big businesses. We tell you this simply isn't true. Peter told you this at second. We think minority Indigenous communities would just be no, actually, we don't want to engage with your tourism. And then the tourism people literally wouldn't be able to come back. They'd be trespassed. They'd be able to take a court case against them, or be able to tell them to simply go away. We don't think that was a valid point by then. But secondly, on this, we tell you that all of the examples they use today were New Zealand centric, right? We tell you that most nations don't have government relations between their Indigenous cultures and the government. Not everyone has iwi representatives. If we go to the USA, right, which is a lot of content in our case that they ultimately ignored, the people the US government couldn't care less about Hawaii or the Navajo region. They couldn't care less that they are taking rights away from these people. All they care about is being marketable so that the government can get tourism income and tax income. This is the goal of the government. We know through their actions, we know by not giving these communities rights that they actually simply do not care. We've seen this historically. We continue to see it now when these governments don't provide help or clarity to these Indigenous populations. Thirdly, though, we tell you that acceptance is only promoted by the government as long as Indigenous people are approving of the government and are willing to engage in the systems they want to engage with. The government's only wow, we love our minorities when they are thankful for the advertising and really happy to be there. As soon as they start lobbying for the government to give their rights back, to give them their land, to solve poverty, to solve the huge educational gap and the wage gap, the government's oh, actually, we don't want anything to do with you. Sorry about that, but you look nice on our poster. This is something we simply cannot stand for, yet is something that NEC has been very willing to perpetuate. We tell you that is crucially where they lose on this point. Fourthly, though, we tell you that if the government actually was accepting of Indigenous cultures, we'd see them returning land. We'd see them creating protected areas, giving the Navajo region back to the Navajo people. But instead, we don't see this. We see that the government only wants it for a good image, and as soon as they've got the nice pictures or the nice promotion video, they stop. They don't actually care. That's a crucial misunderstanding in their case today. But fifthly and finally on this, right, we tell you that the whole point about jobs was just really, really awful and quite tokenistic to be oh, we don't think Indigenous people have jobs. We'll just get them to engage in tourism and then they can get jobs in tourism. Rather than addressing the systemic issues of trying to be no, actually, we should try and get political capital for these people to have jobs. They're just nah, we'll just give them jobs in tourism. That's so harmful. It literally perpetuates these issues by saying, no, Māori should just go and work in tourism. We think it's far better under our side when you give them the opportunity to create their own platforms, not influenced by the government, to be actually, we do need help in these areas, actually, like, we do need to be like lobbying for their own success. We think there's far better. This is how we get crucial outcomes. Now moving, at the end of this point, what we've ultimately proven to you is that we get better outcomes and protection for Indigenous people and cultures because we care about their cultural like existence. We don't think we should simply leave them to die out. We think that we should like tell the government that it's not okay to have this influence. We think the government should actually start doing something if they want this, and the Indigenous cultures shouldn't feel pressured or like coerced to accept advertising for the government because that's the only way the government is actually willing to help them. I'll take a point.
Given that the United States is this ultra-capitalist state, how do you respond to the fact that most of the promotion of Hawaiian culture is actually by private firms rather than government?
Like, still, the fact of the matter is the government still stands by and supports this. The government's not going to be like, oh no, we don't want the tax money from that tourism. They're going to be like, yeah, baby, ramp it up, show those hula skirts. Like, even if Joe Biden is like really progressive and happy like you want him to be, we still don't think we get that good change. Now moving on to like who gets better cultural inclusivity. Like, they told us like they'd just do things like get the haka into schools, get te reo in schools, and that like you'd get Indigenous representation around the country, although they didn't really mechanize how this works, so we're a bit unclear. And they told you that like people will just vote to be inclusive. 3 key responses here. Firstly, we tell you like the benefits about like having the haka in school or like teaching te reo is not mutually exclusive. Like Peter's entire split, which they ignored, which was about like pushing education and resources into schools. This is not something that's reliant on the government doing advertising. We think the government should do this anyway. Like, the government still has an obligation to help people, even if they're not advertising. We don't think any of that was mutually exclusive, those benefits they tried to claim. But secondly, on the point of voting, right, we tell you that most voters are simply not Indigenous. Indigenous populations have been closed out of the voting system because of the colonization that has occurred. Therefore, when it comes to voting on like Indigenous issues, you have a whole bunch of white people who maybe like just don't want to engage with colonization because they'll feel really guilty. They're probably not going to vote in favor of these like minority communities. They're not going to vote in favor of like the Navajo region becoming independent or like banning tourism from Hawaii because they are the white people that go to these countries on holiday, have a look at the marginalized communities and be like, wow, that was such a nice photo. I'm going to go back to my rich hotel that is polluting the land these people live on and have a nice sleep and not feel guilty about it. We think crucially that's where they lose the case. They make the assumption that like somehow it's going to get far better for minorities when we have tourism, and they've ignored all of our content about like why tourists are actually destroying the environment, actually do not care. Most of the time are these wealthy white people who just like couldn't give like a second glance at what cultural minorities are doing. Under our side, we elevate these people because we tell you that like it's not acceptable to stop being inclusive. Thirdly then, and finally, we tell you that like we shouldn't just let regions die out like their second Meg said, because they want some privacy. Like, we think it's totally valid if Marae don't want people to come onto their land. Like, that's sacred. That's something we support. We don't think we should be marketing it. That's where they fundamentally lose. Their point on tourism kind of falls out of the debate here. It was so minor, we kind of disproved that in our other points anyway. At the end of the case today, we've proven to you that we are the side. Am I audible? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Affirm
farming lost the debate today when they decided to concede that they just going to willing to let anyone exploit these people as long as it's not the government, without providing actual substantive as to how they were going to mechanize actual protection and take a straw man of all of our incentives on political capital and impacts in terms of how we protect these local people. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to go through some characterization on what context actually matters. Secondly, I'm going to ask the question of on principle. Thirdly, on protection of local people. And finally, on the local community more than just Indigenous people. So firstly, just some clarification. Note that what they tried to claim was that, somehow we have to have so many international contexts that matter. Levi already clearly told you that this context only matters in situations where the government is actually have an incentive and feel like they could promote this culture for tourism because they know that the voters are likely going to be accepting of it, because as the government, the biggest incentive is that voters are happy, right? So that means that this motion largely takes place in the relevant situation, which is that local the voter population probably do enjoy this. So like their repeated example of Hawaii, where like it is largely capitalistic and everyone just prizes money rather than like justified like historical wrongs, it's probably not that relevant. Secondly, we can also just give you another example where Canada is supporting the Inuit people, where those people think it is important to correct historical injustices. So what that means is that these contexts are the ones that actually matter. Next up on principle. First, the key claim here was that the government is principally inclined to not do it because they're tokenistic and racist. 2 responses, I'll take it.
You talked about the Inuit people being represented by Canada. How would you like a comment on the genocides that are covered up in that nation semi-regularly?
We tell you that it is because the fact that we know about the genocides now, which shows us the change in perspective, right? Canada is now realizing the historical injustices. We tell you that proves our point, where the government is now seeing where people are actually like realize the historical injustices, right? That's a shift in perspective. But on principle, on like their principle inclination, 2 responses. Firstly, note that this principle is contingent on the outcome of Indigenous people actually benefiting. We'll talk about that later, but we'll just say that they don't actually benefit it, so they don't get to claim this principle. Secondly, we give you a counter principle and a counter obligation of precisely that the government must help these people through promoting this tourism and actually benefiting them because of the colonial repatriation, which means that they have an special obligation to actually benefit it. We flip that principle, so all of the work done actually contributes to our part, where we tell you that because of that principle exists, we're the side that actually has we actually benefit the Indigenous people by the hands of the government because of this obligation. But next, on protection of local communities. First claim, their claim was that local businesses can just somehow help themselves and Indigenous people can somehow help themselves. 4 things. Firstly, note that they said at second that you have a choice on jobs and then trailed off saying, oh yeah, except for the systemic issues. Note that they do not solve any systemic issues. What do they do in terms of political capital? They don't actually resolve any of the systemic issues. So what that means is that let's characterize what the systemic issues looks like. It looks like people being stigmatized, Indigenous people being stigmatized against because they think that they're not good enough, because they're barbaric, because they don't have access to education, because they've been taken away from their families and face intergenerational trauma. Those systemic issues, they do not resolve. What that means then is that they don't actually have a choice on jobs. Crucially then, this means that the claim on that people can help themselves do not stand in the debate. But secondly then, we flip that by telling you that on our side of the house, we're the side that gives guaranteed employment, because the government, when they do tourism, they have an incentive to increase authenticity, right? Which means that they are much more likely to employ local businesses. On the comparative of companies could just do some black-facing, whatever, like problematic practices that don't actually include Indigenous people because they don't have as strong of an incentive in terms of political capital. What that means then is that we crucially provide these Indigenous people more jobs. We tell you firstly, this is important because Indigenous people do need these jobs because of the systemic issues that they just try to wash away by not talking about it. But secondly, moreover, even if it isn't, it's like Indigenous people have an upper hand in terms of this employment. So we provide them with this financial benefit, right? Third response on this is that governments are going to be much better in helping themselves for 3 reasons. A, because they're powerful, they have social connections, so then they can engage with other institutions. B, they can support financially because governments have a large a large budget in which they can support these businesses to start them up. What this means then is that these businesses can get help rather than trying to crowdfund. We don't know, like, because they haven't characterized how the local businesses can help themselves, right? So C, people listen to the government. What this means is that they're much more likely to engage with like this tourism and these local businesses, right? All three of those reasons are different reasons as to why we're likely to get much more effective help for local businesses, even especially because of the fact that they're promoting tourism. So they want to have these local businesses selling their merch and promoting the local economy. Fourthly, then, their cultural preservation point here doesn't really stand. Why? Because culture matters less when you can't put bread on the table. When Indigenous people are historically much more poor and don't have the ability to have bread on the table, culture probably doesn't matter as much because by the hierarchy of needs, you fulfill material needs before you fulfill spiritual needs. But furthermore, we're going to flip this by telling you that governments can probably have a lot more resources to preserve the culture rather than the people themselves who like maybe haven't separated historically because of the historical problems in terms of like the disconnections, right? So at the end of this, we flip all of those claims and we tell you that we're the side that actually benefits crucially in this first way, which is so important to these Indigenous people. Secondly, then, their claim is that the government is going to be worse than the company. Firstly, some weird responses on slave labor and the environment harms, right? Firstly, note that like the public scrutiny of the government will mean probably that there's more protection. But secondly, companies are probably going to be much worse. They can provide coercive contracts. And also Hawaii, the example that they brought up because of farms, are like the environmental harms are because of the companies. The government probably doesn't want their land to be ruined because they own the land. They have an extra incentive to protect the environment there. Secondly, on reforms, they say that they get more political capital. Why? We don't really see reasons why, right? They never mechanize it. But we clearly mechanize to you why we gain political capital. Even if it's initially bad, once Indigenous people become involved in the mainstream through the entwinement of cultural identity, which we very clearly mechanized to you at Jess, that means that people will probably be more support. They claim that, oh, white people vote or maintain, it's going to be unfair. We tell you that at the end, that still means that white people support these people. So we think that it gains in political capital, right? Secondly, then we also give Indigenous people opportunity to provide platforms. We tell you that because we're promoting them, because we still have them as a face, we need them, right? The government does need them, which is why they get support. Next up on government, they claim that government is not a bad actor. They're probably more incentivized than a company because a company is profit driven. And we've given you so many reasons as to government is going to be a good actor, political capital, and also the incentives, right? Thirdly, then on their claim that companies can go away, look, coercion, and also if companies become the intermediary, they could totally work with the government and act like an extra exploitation. We prefer the government to directly interact them without the company being harmed, right? They never engage with that. Fourthly, then governments cannot just stop, governments are not just going to stop after the video. At the end of this, we've proven to you why it is that we protect the people. When they don't engage with that, when they say that they just don't want the government at all costs without any mechanization, we win this debate today.
Good thing I checked if it was muted. I say politely that the problem with side affirming's case today's debate is that it's built on a counterfactual they cannot and do not prove. It is built on this idea that they are the house that suddenly gets people to care about Indigenous issues, that suddenly just is able to ignore all the structural issues that they apparently want to solve and that are so problematic. Instead, what we say is they reinforce them on a number of levels and allow people to continue to not care about Indigenous communities. 3 points for the house today then. Firstly, on decolonization, secondly, on cultural representation, and thirdly, on the economic benefits of this type of tourism promotion. Firstly, then on decolonization, okay? We think that that there's been next to no engagement with our material on national identity, which we brought to you at first, outside of something about a white saviors complex at second. And we think that decolonization starts and ends with the idea that we are one people. That is something that we exclusively get on our side, because when we start to put culture into the mainstream of how New Zealand is seen, of how national identity exists, people become more sympathetic to it, people start to identify with it, and people start to care about these issues. No engagement there. It starts when people think of Indigenous culture as their national culture that operates on both a local and international scale. No response on how this happens on their side of the house. We never get any solid reason, actually, for how AF solves this issue of decolonization. We firstly ask, how do they get opportunities in those other job industries? It's quite ironic and quite ignorant when it's second, they tell us that there's nothing stopping an Indigenous man from going and getting a job in any industry, except for structural racism, okay? That is something that we actually pay attention to, and that is something we are trying to solve on our side of the house. We also explain why these nations are likely to be the ones already on that pathway with voter incentives. No engagement here. We also say that we make people feel, at the very least, more accepted because their culture becomes ingrained in New Zealand's culture. This firstly comes through that promotion. It comes through that education on te reo, because they're trying to push this this nation being this type of, I should say native languages, of being an accepting nation. And thirdly, on the government engagement with those cultural leaders, because they're trying to understand that culture, because they're going to get called out for racism otherwise. That's something exclusive to our side, where there is, as opposed to affirming, gets no engagement with these communities. They remain isolationist. Apparently that is their best goal. Which leads me into my second point on cultural representation, okay? We simply point out that we can win this point when we prove our counterfactual that is much more inaccurate under firms, whether you have a public versus a private entity that is not subject to the same level of scrutinization, and also that the fact that being kicked out of a marae, as they tell us, doesn't actually stop these guys from going out and making these racist portrayals, as I told you at second, and as Janet told you at third. A racist government won't stop them anyway, as third AF tells us. So how do they solve the issue then of those firms trying to exploit this, of misrepresenting cultures? The reality is simply that they don't. They allow them to continue on this path because their main focus is on Hawaii, where that is such a problem. Their main focus to prove that government is promoting culture is the problem is an instance where it is promoted privately. That is why they lose this point. We also win this lastly and extend the margin, because even if you don't believe that it's still likely to happen under firms, we say that culture is still likely to die out if it allows itself to be isolationist, to force people out because they need to go and get those jobs, because they want to go and get employment, as they historically do, as we've told you from the start. No engagement for why this is not likely to happen. That is why they lose this point. Thirdly, they're on economic benefits, okay? The reason this is important is, we'll give you 4 reasons that this matters in today's debate and why we're the side that exclusively gets it, as I've already proven, okay? Firstly is on pagan, like the fact that pagan African cultures, as they're brought up, are more worried about people dying of starvation than if their culture gets accurately represented in media. Secondly, it goes to people because of governments, it goes to the Indigenous people because of governments' incentive in nations that do this type of thing, at least more than multinational corporations operating in the tourism industry ever will. Thirdly, we think it's more likely to benefit Indigenous-owned businesses anyway, as is the side affirming counterfactual, due to the large-scale promotion of what they're selling, encouraging people to go and engage with those businesses, because this is about promotion. And even if you ignore our material on urbanization, these are still sold locally. Lastly, the alternative is a dope water park on Indigenous land, because tourism still happens. That is not something we will stand for. That is why we are very proud to oppose.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, cool. Our path to victory in today's debate was to prove to you that we get better cultural outcomes and protections for Indigenous peoples. We have done this through two main points of clash. Firstly, on who benefits Indigenous people the most, and secondly, on cultural inclusivity. There's been a third minor clash on some economic stuff, but due to that coming up at 30 seconds to the end of the second neg speech, that's largely not featured as highly in today's debate. So on the first point of clash about who gets better outcomes for the Indigenous people the most, we told you about how marketing Indigenous people groups prevents effective change for these groups. We told you about how it turns them into a commodity that is bought and sold and marketed, and about how harmful this is to these people. We told you all the way from first through third, we told you about how harmful this can be to these cultures and how it starts to prevent change. We told you about how this stops them being able to rise political capital, because the way they're being marketed is in this way of, oh, let's go watch the cool Indigenous people do their cool Indigenous dances and do these things. We've given you numerous examples today of over a range of nations which the NEG team has failed to properly address until way late in the debate. I'm instead choosing to focus mostly on a New Zealand-centric model and miss out really on the nuances of a lot of our points. So how have they... we've also told you about how tourism creates these unique harms to these cultures. We've told you about how they can, how they create these harms to the environment of these people, and how by promoting this tourism exclusively based on their cultures, it creates this these unique harms that we've told you about from first today about how have they responded to this? First, they've told us that the government will just fix these issues because they're held accountable. We've given you substantive analysis today on this point about how a majority of the peoples in these nations where the governments are reigning are simply not from these minority groups of the Indigenous peoples. And so the accountability simply isn't there in the way that they would have us believe it is. They've told us that they would just provide all the Indigenous people with tourism jobs. And what we tell you today is that simply perpetuates the systemic injustices that they are facing. When they tell you today that because there is systemic injustice, what we should do is force all of the minorities into tourism jobs, they fundamentally misunderstand the problems that they are trying to deal with today. From Arcadia today, we've told you about on tourism, we've told you about how these how tourism can be used through natural attractions like glaciers or snowboarding in the Southern Alps. So we've told you about how unique cultural things like Big Ben or Buckingham Palace in England, or about these other tourism things can promote this tourism without uniquely harming these cultural actors in today's debate. But crucially, they never considered this impact on them and seemed to tell us that instead that it needed to be extremely focused on these cultural outcomes. Moving on to the second point of clash about cultural inclusivity, we've given points today to telling you about how we would help to tackle systemic injustice by giving people the choice. Instead, they told us that we shouldn't let Indigenous peoples become isolationist because it would force them to die out. We tell you that today, when they tell us that as the government we should force Indigenous peoples not to be isolationists, they're fundamentally misunderstanding today's debate and not giving them the rights that these people deserve, the rights to make their own choices, rather than forcing them into specific things because we think we know what is best for them. And finally, on the last point of clash about the economic things, even if we take them at their best and assume that their material was significant, even though it came out way late in the debate, we've given you, like Arcadia has told you, we've given at first about how this tourism still continues under our side of the debate because of these natural attractions that it continue to exist regardless of trying to turn our native peoples into commodities. And so at the end of the day, we tell you that we win today's debate by giving the Indigenous peoples the dignity and choices that they deserve as human beings. And so we are proud to affirm.